Some souls are born not with silver spoons, but with scars already carved into their first breath. Willie Nelson, at 92 years old, sits on a Texas ranch worth millions, surrounded by land that stretches toward horizons he once thought he'd never reach. But behind that weathered smile, behind those gentle eyes that have seen 7 decades of spotlights, lies a weight most could never imagine carrying. This is not just the story of a country music legend. This is the story of a man who turned abandonment into anthems, betrayal into ballads, and loss into a legacy that will outlive us all. Hit like as a tribute to a voice that refused to be silenced, even when the world tried to erase it. On a dusty April morning in 1933, in the forgotten corners of Abbott, Texas, a baby boy entered a world that had already decided it didn't want him. Willie Nelson took his first breath in a town where the sun didn't just shine, it punished. Where poverty wasn't a condition, it was a religion. And where love, when it came at all, came with conditions he was too young to meet. His mother walked away first. No goodbye, no explanation, just the sound of a door closing and footsteps fading into nothing. She simply vanished, like smoke dissipating into the merciless Texas heat. His father, a man barely holding the fragments of his own life together, remarried and disappeared too, leaving behind 2 children who were too small to understand betrayal but old enough to feel its teeth. Willie and his sister Bobby were placed into the care of their grandparents, poor but kind-hearted souls who patched together love from scraps and prayers. Behind every meal they scraped together was the silence of parents who were alive somewhere in the world but chose not to be present. Behind every night Willie lay awake staring at cracked ceilings was a question that would haunt him for decades. Why wasn't I enough? His grandfather, a blacksmith with hands rough as tree bark and a heart softer than hymns, became the boy's only anchor. He was the first to place a guitar in Willie's small hands, the first to show him that sound could fill the spaces where love should have been. And then, when Willie was just 6 years old, pneumonia stole him away. The man who had been his hero, his teacher, his only source of stability, gone. Buried in Texas dirt, while a little boy stood at the graveside, clutching a guitar he barely knew how to play. Years later, Willie would write with aching clarity, "Our separation from mother and daddy seemed worse than a death because they were still out there in the world. But they weren't with me and Bobby like they were supposed to be." Imagine that cruelty. Imagine being a child who knows your parents are breathing, walking, living, just not with you, not for you. The abandonment wasn't clean like death. It lingered, festered, became the soundtrack to his childhood. By the time he turned 7 in 1940, Willie wasn't playing with toys or chasing dreams of childhood innocence. He was clinging to a guitar as if it were oxygen, learning chords not for joy but for survival. At 9 years old, while other boys played marbles in the dirt, he was performing in smoky bars with the Bohemian Polka Band, singing not for applause but for someone, anyone to hear him. He sang gospel in church on Sundays, but even in God's house, his voice carried the tremor of a boy who had learned too early that love always leaves. Behind every note he played was hunger, not just for food, though that was real too, but for connection, for proof that he mattered. The world saw a talented child. What they didn't see was a little boy filling silence with song because no one else was talking to him. Fear, hunger, and silence became his teachers. And the lessons they taught were brutal. The Texas sun doesn't just shine, it brands. And for teenage Willie Nelson, that blistering heat became part of a daily ritual of survival that felt more like punishment. By 14, sometime around 1947, his hands were already scarred from picking cotton in fields that stretched endlessly under skies that offered no mercy. He bent over rows until his back screamed, pulling fiber from the earth just to keep food on a table that never felt full enough. But cotton fields were only one chapter in a book of desperation. He cycled through more jobs than most adults accumulate in a lifetime. Tree trimmer, phone operator, nightclub bouncer, encyclopedia salesman, disc jockey. He scrubbed dishes in greasy kitchens, patched saddles for cowboys, climbed telephone poles in thunderstorms, and knocked on doors selling $600 encyclopedia sets to families who couldn't afford bread. "I was selling encyclopedias to people who couldn't afford a decent meal," he would later confess, his voice heavy with the memory. It didn't feel right. But when you're young, broke, and chasing something as fragile as a dream, you take what you can. He played guitar in bars at night, spun country records on dusty turntables during the day, and slept wherever exhaustion finally claimed him, sometimes on floors, sometimes in his car, sometimes not at all. And Nashville, that glittering promised land where every country musician dreams of arriving, slammed its doors in his face again and again. No label, no interest, no promise. Just silence that felt louder than any rejection letter. Then came a moment so dark, so piercing, that Willie almost didn't survive it. In his 20s, living in a broken-down trailer on the edge of a cemetery near Nashville, overwhelmed by failure and drowning his grief in whiskey, Willie walked out into the night. He lay down in the middle of a usually busy street, not because he wanted to make a statement, but because he didn't know what else to do. Cars veered around him like he was debris, not a human being. No one stopped. No one even slowed down. "Was I relieved?" he would later write. "Was I disappointed? Can't say for sure. All I know is I got up, walked back to the bar, and had another drink." Behind that calm recollection was a man who had touched the edge of surrender and somehow found the strength to step back. One freezing night, with no money and nowhere to sleep, he tried hitchhiking to Portland, Oregon, to find the mother who had abandoned him decades earlier. No one stopped, so he curled up in a ditch near the highway, rain soaking through his thin jacket, his guitar the only thing between him and absolute despair. Then a stranger, a truck driver who would never know the life he saved, offered him a ride and $10 for a bus ticket. The silence that followed those years would echo through every song Willie would ever write. Because sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is simply refuse to stay broken. Some men write songs. Willie Nelson wrote the soundtrack to other people's dreams and watched from the shadows as they became stars. In the late 1950 seconds, after years of bleeding his soul into melodies no one would hear, he was still picking cotton, still washing dishes, still praying that someone, somewhere would listen. It was 1959. Willie was broke, living in a modest Houston apartment with a baby on the way and hope running thin. He had written a gospel ballad called Family Bible, inspired by memories of his grandmother singing hymns around a worn dinner table. Desperate to buy groceries, not luxuries, just food, he sold the rights for $100. $100 for a song that would become a radio staple, a top hit for Claude Gray, praised for its raw purity and timeless heart. But Willie's name wasn't on the label. The applause came, just not for him. Behind every jukebox play was a man who couldn't afford to hear his own voice on the radio. That heartbreak became a pattern. He penned Crazy, a haunting melody drawn from the deepest chambers of pain and longing, and watched it soar to immortality through Patsy Cline's voice. It became one of the most played jukebox songs of all time. Funny How Time Slips Away found life through Billy Walker. Pretty Paper became Roy Orbison's tender winter anthem. These weren't just songs. They were emotional architecture, the framework of a generation's heartbreak and hope. And yet, to the average listener, Willie Nelson remained invisible. While his lyrics echoed through every bar and living room in America, the man behind the music was serving drinks and hoping someone might remember his name. Nashville wasn't just dismissive, it was cruel. When Willie tried to sing his own truth, producers told him his voice was too rough, too raw, too weathered. They said he didn't have the right look. No pompadour, no rhinestones, just braided hair, gentle eyes, and a face that wore every mile it had traveled. They didn't hear the soul embedded in the gravel. They wanted polish. Willie brought truth. And for that sin, he was told he didn't belong. Behind every rejection letter was a man questioning whether his voice mattered at all. Imagine writing the soundtrack to someone else's success while being told your own story wasn't good enough to be heard. It wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. While other artists climbed charts on lyrics he had bled into existence, he walked darkened streets, searching for second-hand guitars and sympathetic ears. He worked as a DJ in tiny stations that barely paid rent. He played backup in honky-tonks where drunks threw bottles at the stage. And still, he wrote, with every song he gave away, a part of him disappeared into someone else's fame. The heartbreak wasn't loud, it was the kind of slow, constant ache that burrows into your chest and builds a home there. But fate had other plans. In the early 1970 seconds, Nashville quietly made its decision. Willie Nelson didn't belong. His voice didn't fit their mold. His look didn't match their suits. So when RCA dropped him and critics wrote him off as washed up, he packed what little pride remained and drove back to Texas. His ranch in Ridgetop had burned to the ground just months earlier, a fire that felt less like accident and more like prophecy. At 39 years old, broke and bruised, he could have vanished into obscurity. Instead, in the wild, beautiful chaos of Austin, Texas, something unexpected was waiting. Austin wasn't like Nashville. There were no rigid rules about twang or tempo. In smoky bars and backyard stages, long-haired hippies sat shoulder to shoulder with rodeo cowboys. They didn't care if you looked like a rebel, they just cared if you sounded like one. And when Willie walked in, battered by rejection but still humming with poetry, they saw what Nashville never did, an outlaw. In 1973, he released Shotgun Willie, a ragged, unapologetic album that didn't beg for approval. It just told the truth. For the first time in his life, people listened. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. That album cracked open the door. Phases and stages kicked it wider. Then, in 1975 came Red-Headed Stranger, a stripped-down concept album built on haunting silences and sparse production. Critics called it unmarketable. Fans called it a revelation. It went multi-platinum, proving that sometimes the world doesn't know what it needs until someone brave enough refuses to compromise. Behind every note on that album was a man who had finally stopped apologizing for who he was. That same year, he joined forces with Waylon Jennings, Jesse Coulter, and Tom Paul Glazer to create Wanted, the Outlaws, the first country album to ever go platinum. Suddenly, the man they once dismissed became the face of a movement. Willie didn't just sing about heartbreak anymore, he was living proof that from the ashes of rejection, a new kind of fire could rise. The world saw triumph. What Willie experienced was vindication wrapped in exhaustion. Because while the spotlight finally found him, the darkness he'd been running from was about to catch up. Just as Willie Nelson was rising from decades of rejection, his personal life was crumbling under secrets too heavy to carry in silence. He was married to Shirley Colley, his second wife, a singer, a partner, someone who had stood beside him through endless nights on the road. Then, one quiet afternoon, Shirley opened a hospital bill by mistake. It wasn't addressed to her, but the name printed inside was unmistakable: Mrs. Connie Nelson. The charge was for the delivery of a baby girl. When she confronted him, Willie finally confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "Connie's my girlfriend. Paula's our daughter." Behind that confession was the shattering of whatever fragile trust remained between them. The marriage ended, swift and final. "There's no such thing as ex-wives," Willie would later say with a weary smile, "only additional ones." The line was wrapped in humor, but beneath it lived exhaustion, the weariness of too many goodbyes. Behind the outlaw image was a man who couldn't seem to stop running, even from the people who loved him. Around that same time, flames consumed his Ridgetop ranch. His marriage, his home, his Nashville dreams all reduced to ash and smoke. At 40 years old, Willie found himself emotionally bankrupt, standing in ruins both literal and metaphorical. There was a moment when he nearly quit music entirely, but something inside refused to die. What the cameras never captured was the way he bled quietly and kept walking through fire, through failure, through heartbreak, never stopping, never surrendering, always singing. By the dawn of the 1,990 seconds, Willie Nelson had already survived the impossible. He'd rebuilt himself from ash and become an icon. Then came the letter. Cold, official, unforgiving. The IRS demanded $16.7 million in unpaid taxes. In an instant, everything Willie had rebuilt was seized. Federal agents raided his home. They even took Trigger, his beloved guitar. To Willie, losing Trigger wasn't about losing an instrument, it was watching his soul get carried out the door in an evidence bag. For someone who had already lost so much, this could have been the final blow. But Willie didn't hide. He didn't declare bankruptcy. Instead, he did what he had always done when the world knocked him down. He made music. In 1992, with nothing but a stripped-down studio and his weathered voice, he recorded the IRS tapes. Who'll Buy My Memories? The concept was devastatingly simple. A man singing his story, offering up his past to buy back his future. And then something extraordinary happened. America listened, not with pity, but with love. Fans rallied behind him. They bought the album, not because they felt sorry for him, but because they remembered the songs that had comforted them in loneliness. Little by little, dollar by dollar, Willie chipped away at the mountain of debt. By the mid-1,990 seconds, most of the debt was paid. He got Trigger back, scarred and sacred, just like him. Behind every payment made was a man who refused to be defined by his lowest moment. But even legends bleed in silence. And for Willie, the deepest cuts were yet to come. It was Christmas Day, 1991. While millions lit candles and embraced family, Willie Nelson received a phone call that shattered something inside him that would never fully heal. His firstborn son, Willie Nelson, had passed away. "I've never experienced anything so devastating in my life," Willie would later say, his voice stripped of its usual steadiness. Because there are no songs for a pain like that. No melody deep enough to hold the weight of a father's grief. For years after, every note Willie strummed carried an echo of Billy's voice, a memory forever unfinished. Every Christmas since has been haunted by that phone call. He stopped playing Christmas shows for a while, and when he finally returned, fans said they could hear it in his voice, a weight behind each lyric, a pause where there never used to be one. Behind every holiday song he sang was a father's ache, quiet but unrelenting. Then came February 2020. Paul English, his drummer, bodyguard, outlaw companion, and brother in spirit, passed away at 87. Paul wasn't just a bandmate, he was family in the truest sense. They met in 1955 when Willie was still sleeping in cars. Through bar fights and empty wallets, through endless highways, Paul was there. He carried cash in his boots, guarded the band with a pistol when needed, settled scores with a look that made grown men back down. When Paul died, something in Willie's world fell silent too. On stage, the band kept playing, but Willie knew something was missing in the rhythm, something that could never be replaced, only remembered. Behind every drumbeat that followed was the ghost of the one that mattered most. 2 years later, in 2022, his sister Bobby Nelson passed away. Bobby wasn't just his sibling, she was his first duet, his first bandmate, his lifelong musical shadow. Together they had been raised by grandparents, after being abandoned by both parents. It was Bobby who stood beside him at the family piano, who played on his first records, who knew every scar he'd carried since childhood. In their book together, Willie wrote, "Without my sister, I'd never be where I am today. I've always needed her." When she died, It wasn't just loss, it was the collapse of a bridge to everything he used to be. She wasn't just part of his music, she was part of his memory, a keeper of truths no one else remembered. He still plays her favorite songs, but he plays them slower now, as if waiting for a note that never arrives. And then, in September 2024, came the final blow. Kris Kristofferson, Willie's brother-in-arms, fellow highwayman, and sole confidant, passed away at 88. Their friendship wasn't just professional, it was cosmic. Together with Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings, they became the Highwaymen, a supergroup of rebels who didn't just sing about freedom but embodied it. After Kris passed, Willie said softly, "He left a lot of fantastic songs around for the rest of us to sing. I hated to lose him." But it wasn't just about songs. It was about losing the last voice that truly understood his. With Johnny gone, Waylon gone, and now Kris Willie stands alone, the final highwayman. Behind that calm smile is a man walking through a graveyard of memories, carrying ghosts that grow heavier with each passing year. Every song now is a conversation with the ones who left. Every lyric a whispered prayer. Every performance an eulogy with rhythm. And maybe that's why Willie Nelson is still here, not to escape the pain, but to transform it into something the world can hold on to. There's a quiet war that rages behind Willie Nelson's weathered smile, one that lives in every labored breath he takes. In a haunting admission from his memoir, Willie recalled swapping eggs from his family's chicken coop for packs of Camel cigarettes at just 6 years old. What started as a child's imitation became a shadow that followed him through every triumph. "Cigarettes killed my mother, father, stepmother, and stepfather," he would later confess. "Half the people in my family were killed by cigarettes." Yet for decades, he couldn't quit. He sang through the smoke, toured through the wheezing, smiled through the burn in his chest. Willie was diagnosed with emphysema, a slow, merciless disease that eats away at lung tissue. In 2015, with his health declining rapidly, he underwent stem cell treatment. By then, he'd already suffered a collapsed lung. Behind every standing ovation was a man struggling simply to breathe. Though he finally gave up tobacco, Willie turned to marijuana not out of rebellion, but relief. It dulled the pain, eased the inflammation. When smoking anything became too dangerous, he shifted to edibles, a quiet, almost poetic transition. The fire was gone, but the spark remained. His son Lucas once said, "That's what makes him inspiring to me, his resilience in the face of adversity. For every scar on his lungs, there's a verse he's written in its place." At 92, while most men count pills, Willie counts down to his next show. Behind the fragile frame is a will forged in fire, unbreakable despite all evidence to the contrary. His health may have betrayed him, but his spirit hasn't. When you've faced your own breath as an enemy and still choose to sing, you become something more than an artist. You become a testament to the power of refusal to quit, refusal to surrender. At 92 years old, Willie Nelson lives a life that feels more like poetry than retirement. Far from fading into obscurity, he has carved out a peaceful existence on a private ranch nestled in the heart of Texas, a place where the wind hums through ancient trees like the strings of his scarred guitar. The ranch itself, located near Spicewood, Texas, spans hundreds of acres and is estimated to be worth over $3 million. The home is filled with memorabilia from 7 decades of music, gold records on walls, photographs of faces now gone, instruments that have witnessed history. There's a recording studio tucked away on the property where he still creates when inspiration strikes. Behind every artifact is a memory, and behind every memory, a scar. His vehicle collection tells its own story. There's his vintage tour bus, Honeysuckle Rose, a rolling home that's traveled more miles than most people will in 10 lifetimes. A Cadillac from the 72nds, classic and understated. A simple pickup truck for days when he just needs to check fences or haul hay. Behind each vehicle is wealth, whispered. Never shouted, not possession but partnership. Willie's net worth, as of 2025, is estimated between $25 and $30 million, a fortune rebuilt from nothing after the IRS took everything. That money comes from tour revenues, royalties, and Willie's Remedy, his successful line of CBD products. But you'd never know he had money by looking at him. He wears the same old boots, rides the same beat-up bus, carries the same scarred guitar trigger, with a hole worn through its body from decades of picking. Family has become Willie's true fortune. His children, especially Lucas and Amy, play active roles in his life and art. Lucas often shares the stage with his father, carrying forward the legacy. Their performances together aren't concerts, they're conversations between generations. Willie's charitable work speaks louder than his bank account. He co-founded Farm Aid in 1985, a benefit concert that has raised over $60 million for family farmers. He's donated millions to causes, ranging from animal welfare to disaster relief, often quietly. Behind every dollar given is a man who remembers hunger, remembers desperation, remembers when $10 for a bus ticket felt like salvation. In April 2025, he released his 76th solo studio album, The Last Leaf on the Tree, produced alongside his son Micah. The title alone carries weight and acknowledgement of mortality. Each track dives into the reality of aging, the weight of loss, the lightness of letting go. Critics are calling it one of the most profound late-career works in country music history. Despite his age, Willie continues to perform live. In October 2024, he stunned the world by appearing on stage in Texas with Beyoncé. The moment was more than performance. It was a cultural bridge, proof that authenticity transcends genre and generation. Willie is now the last living member of the Highwaymen. He carries not just his own memories, but theirs too. Every time he takes the stage, he brings them with him, ghosts made of melody. Behind every performance is a communion with the dead, a refusal to let their voices be forgotten. Willie's perspective on death remains as calm and grounded as his music. "I don't hurt anywhere," he told the Associated Press in 2025. "I don't worry about dying." It wasn't bravado. It was peace, the kind earned through decades of storms weathered. He no longer fights time. He welcomes it. Behind that calm acceptance is a soul finally at rest with itself, no longer running, no longer hiding, just being. This is a man who has given everything: his voice, his words, his wounds for the sake of song. And he still gives. He still tours. He still creates. He still laughs with friends under Texas skies. If you've ever tapped your foot to one of his tunes, wiped a tear during one of his verses, or found yourself humming on the road again on a long drive home, you've carried a piece of him with you. Leave a comment below sharing your favorite Willie Nelson memory. Hit like not just for the music, but for the man, for the soul who turned a lifetime of pain into melodies that will outlive us all. Because some voices never go silent, some hearts never stop singing. The final image is simple: an old man on a Texas porch as the sun sets, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. His guitar rests beside him, scarred but sacred. The wind carries his voice across fields that stretch toward forever. He's not performing, he's not proving anything. He's just there, still breathing, still singing, still refusing to let the silence win. Behind that sunset is a man who learned that legends aren't born from perfection. They're forged in fire, shaped by loss, and defined not by how many times they fell, but by how many times they stood back up and kept singing anyway. And as long as there's air in his lungs and strings on his guitar, Willie Nelson will keep doing what he's always done, turning pain into beauty, loss into legacy, and silence into songs that echo across generations. Not for fame, not for money, but because some souls were simply born to sing, and his, bruised and weathered and beautiful, has never learned how to stop.